Hello, I'm Kwangu Liwewe, and welcome to Africa 360. Relations between Africa and the United States have come a long way, dating back to the slavery era. However, the long-standing relationship between the two has evolved. Africa is now regarded as one of the global key strategic partners and not a helpless continent, as was the case before. This week, we examine the political and economic ties that bind the United States and Africa.
With roots dating back to slavery, the US and Africa share a past that goes back over 200 years. But what lies at the heart of this relationship in the 21st century? Yesterday's slaves are today the citizens and leaders of one of the world's most dynamic and fastest growing regions. 2 months ago, President Obama welcomed African leaders to the first ever US-Africa Summit, the largest event any US president has held with African heads of state. The summit sent a clear message.
We agreed that Africa's growth depends, first and foremost, on continued reforms in Africa, by Africans. The leaders here pledged to step up efforts to pursue reforms that attract investment, reduce barriers that stifle trade, especially between African countries, and to promote regional integration.
As the scramble for Africa's resources heightens, so too does America's interest in the continent, particularly in trade and security. After China, the US is Africa's biggest trade partner. The African Growth and Opportunities Act was signed in 2000 as a means of strengthening trade relations between the US and Africa. AGOA has given the US a trade presence in 43 African countries. Since its inception, trade flows have tripled, peaking at $100 billion in 2008. When it comes to security, the United States is by far the world's largest financial contributor to UN peacekeeping operations. It supports missions in the Central African Republic, the DRC, Mali, Somalia, Sudan and South Sudan. In 2006, the United States went a step further, establishing the US-Africa Command. Its military presence extends to every African country except Egypt, with at least 8 operating locations around the continent. Ties between the two sides have come a long way, and it seems the partnership between these two regions will strengthen even further. But important questions remain. Have we moved away from the unequal power relations of the past, or has Africa simply invited the US in to pursue its own imperialistic ambitions?
A historical relationship that has grown. But a 3-day visit and the first ever United States-Africa Summit held in Washington, D.C. 2 months ago is believed to have strengthened ties between the two regions even further. I recently caught up with the United States Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, during her visit to South Africa. Now, if we look back to August when we had the US-Africa Summit, where a number of key African heads of state and government came to Washington to discuss African affairs at this summit. When we look back at it, how did that summit fare?
I think the summit really highlighted the partnership that we have with the continent of Africa. It's not a new partnership. People have said we turned our backs on Africa, and that's absolutely not the case. But the summit highlighted that partnership. And we have moved forward on some initiatives that all of the African countries that we consulted with indicated to us were important. It was important to them to push for more American investment. $33 billion in new investment was announced during the summit. And we announced the new Doing Business in Africa initiative that will focus on opportunities to enhance business with African countries and American companies. And the president announced a tripling of Power Africa. We started out with the concept of 20 million households being provided electricity. It's been increased to 60 million households. We also announced that the YALI, Young African Leaders Initiative, Washington Mandela Washington program will increase in 2016 to double. We brought 500 extraordinarily talented and intelligent young Africans to the United States for 6 weeks. In 2016, we're going to bring 1,000. And again, very, very successful. So the work has just started now that the summit is over.
What's the interest in Africa when it comes to the United States, looking at the continent? Because post-colonial Africa, Africa was once dubbed the hopeless continent, but now it has emerged as one of the major trading partners with most of the world, East and West.
Yeah, it has. And for the United States, we've always been there. It's not new. It's not a new relationship. When Africa achieved its independence, starting in the 1960s, the United States was there. We have embassies in almost every country on the continent, unlike most countries. So we've been engaged with Africa for many, many years. We have a strong partnership. There is a huge African diaspora in the United States from every country. I don't think there's a single country not represented in the Africa diaspora. They are American citizens, many of them, or legal permanent residents, and they advocate for their countries. They advocate for the continent. And they ensure they're almost like ambassadors from Africa to the communities that they live and work in. So again, our interest is not new. We wanted to enhance that interest. We wanted to build on what we see are new opportunities and some old opportunities that we've not taken advantage of. We want to encourage more American companies to do business in Africa.
Now, when we look at the eastern part of the world, we've seen massive investment coming into Africa, specifically from China. Is America really jittery about this relationship between China and Africa?
You know, it's interesting. I get asked that question all the time, and we're not jittery about that relationship. We think that there are enough opportunities on this continent to keep every country who's interested in contributing to Africa's prosperity busy. And we don't see ourselves competing with the Chinese. We see ourselves providing opportunities for American companies as the Chinese are providing opportunities for their companies. In addition, the Chinese are investing in the United States as well. We have encouraged African countries to seek opportunities for investment that benefit their people. But it is important that countries strike deals with China as they would with the United States that are in the best interests of their people. And it is up to countries themselves to strike those deals.
Well, do stay with us. After the break, we'll tackle peace and security on the continent. Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360, and today we're in conversation with the United States Assistant Secretary for African Affairs, Linda Thomas-Greenfield. Now, one of the U.S. key priorities has been peace and security, and as a result of this, the United States has stepped up its war against terrorism on the African continent.
The rising tide of Islamic extremism in Africa is a priority concern for Washington. The U.S. has adopted a more decentralized response to terror, empowering African countries to address their own conflict challenges. However, Washington remains a crucial partner in the fight against terror. In Somalia, the U.S. supports a 22,000-member African force that is driving al-Shabaab away from key strongholds. In the Central African Republic, America provides air support to peacekeepers. The U.S. flies drones from a base in Niger to support French and African troops in Mali, and millions of American dollars contribute to training missions across the continent. At the U.S.-Africa Summit 2 months ago, President Obama reiterated the need to boost Africa's counter-terrorism capabilities, suggesting that in the future, Africa will have to fight its own battles.
Now, when we look at terrorism on the continent, the key ones, we look at Akim, we look at al-Shabaab and Boko Haram. How have the governments in these particular areas been dealing with the fight against terrorism?
I think they've had a challenge. I think this is something that we're seeing across the continent. And it is our view that terrorism anywhere affects all of us everywhere. So we have to support the efforts that these countries are making to deal with these terrorist threats. When we look at the situation with al-Shabaab in Somalia, we're for the first time seeing a ray of light in Somalia, with the efforts against al-Shabaab actually succeeding. They have been pushed back, and we will continue to work with Kenya, with Uganda, with Burundi and other countries who are working in AMISOM to continue to push al-Shabaab out of the major cities and provide support to the Somali government. And we are going to continue to provide support to the Kenyans and the Ugandans as they have dealt with terrorist threats in their own countries. In Nigeria, the Boko Haram threat was initially seen as a Nigeria problem. We know that it's not just a Nigeria problem, it's a regional problem. Boko Haram has not just carried out terrorist attacks in Nigeria, they've carried out terrorist attacks in Cameroon as well, and they've made threats in Chad as well as Niger. So we have to work with Nigeria as well as its neighbors to help them build the capacity to push Boko Haram back and also stop the terror that they are carrying out in northern Nigeria. The situation with Mali, the coup, we work closely with the neighbors, with the French government, with the Mali government to turn that situation around. It's still a work in progress, but it requires, again, a concerted effort that involves not just the countries, but its partners who can provide them with some of the assistance that they may not have the capacity to do.
Now, apart from military intervention, if the United States obviously doesn't negotiate with terrorists, what advice can you give African continents that have this challenge, that apart from military intervention, what else can they do?
Well, fighting terrorism is not just a military responsibility. Terrorists are able to take root into societies that are disaffected, societies that are not vested in their country's future, societies that have not necessarily benefited from the goods and services that their countries have available. So in the situation in northern Nigeria, we have encouraged the Nigerians to take a multifaceted approach to dealing with the situation with Boko Haram. They have to deal with some of the issues that the people in northern Nigeria face, the lack of education, the lack of infrastructure. They have to be able to build a cadre of people who are vested in the future of their country so that they don't buy into the extremist narrative that Boko Haram is preaching.
Let's move back to trade and business, which you talked about early on in the interview. Now, when we look at AGOA, post-2015, do we expect to see this program go on?
We expect to see AGOA continue post-2015. As you know, when the president was here in Africa last summer, he announced a seamless renewal of AGOA. He renewed that announcement during the Africa Leaders Summit, and we are working with our legislature, with our Congress, to push forward the agenda of renewing the AGOA legislation. It's still a work in progress. There's a lot of effort that's being put into that, but there's also effort that needs to take place on this continent as well. As we provide opportunities for countries like South Africa to send duty-free items into the United States, we also want to see some reverse trade benefits. And some of our legislators have noticed that we're not getting those trade benefits when other countries and other regions are getting those trade benefits. So we're trying to work to figure out how we can develop a much more level playing field while continuing with AGOA, because we see the immense benefits that AGOA provide to countries in Africa. We also see that there are some benefits that could be provided to the United States that we're not receiving.
Madam, let's talk about Ebola, which has claimed more than 4,000 lives in West Africa. The United States, of course, has sent in troops to help fight Ebola in that region. My question to you is, apart from troops, is there any other help you're giving?
Absolutely. Before we made the decision to send in troops, the United States was there with these three countries. Our Center for Disease Control, along with USAID, have more than 100 employees based in all three countries that have been assisting these countries in dealing with the Ebola outbreak. As you know, President Obama determined that this is a national security priority for the United States, and upon making that decision, he also decided to send American troops in to help with the infrastructure. But we know that fighting Ebola is not a battle that these three countries can do by themselves or that any single country can help them with. We have to encourage every country on this continent and as well globally to support the efforts to contain this disease. It can be contained. We know that it's ended in places like Uganda and DRC previously. We know that it can be contained in these three countries. We just have to pull out all the stops to do it. And I want to take the opportunity to express our gratitude to all the countries who have participated in this effort, who have contributed medical workers, who have contributed supplies and money to support the efforts of these three countries. But the work is not done yet. We all have to continue to give more until we're able to bring this under control.
Now, one of the criticisms has been that the West only responded when their own people got infected and not when the outbreak happened early on in the year. How do you respond to this?
Yeah, that's absolutely not true. The reason our own people got infected is because they were there and they were helping and they were supporting this effort. We had a DART team in very early on before the two Americans were infected. CDC was there from the beginning of the crisis, even before it hit the news. So we've been there, but I think we all realized that this was bigger than any of us thought. It needed much more effort, and we will continue to support those efforts. But again, it's not just a U.S. problem to support. It's not just the three countries. Everyone has to contribute, and we'll bring it to an end.
Thanks to the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for African Affairs, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, for talking to us here on Africa 360. After the break, I'm joined by two experts to explore the U.S.-Africa relations. Do stay with us.
Everybody's got a plan for Africa. You got the U.S. plan for Africa, Chinese plan for Africa, European plan. Where is the African plan?
Welcome back. You're watching Africa 360, and this week we're focusing on the relationship between Africa and the United States. I'm now joined by our regular contributor to this program, Koffi Kouakou, and he's a senior lecturer at Wits University. Also joining me is Catherine Grant-Makokera, who is a research associate at the South African Institute for International Affairs. Thank you very much for joining us on Africa 360. Now, just recently I spoke to the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, and she's of the view that the relationship between the United States and Africa has actually improved tremendously under the Obama administration. Do you agree with these sentiments?
I think improved tremendously, I would say, is a bit of an overstatement. I don't think it has certainly worsened under President Obama's leadership. But I think that there was very high expectations when we saw an African-American president come into the White House. There was hope that you would see a tremendous improvement. But I don't think we've seen that reflected, certainly, in the initiatives taken. And there are some potential challenges still to come in President Obama's administration with the renewal of the African Growth and Opportunities Act on the agenda for the new Congress coming up in 2015. It's going to be interesting to see whether perhaps President Obama can step up and leave a real legacy.
Yes, in terms of his legacy, obviously after his first term, we did notice that not much had been done in the first term and expected more in the second term. What are your thoughts on her sentiments that things have improved?
I think it's very disappointing. In fact, many of us were really expecting a lot more to what we've seen now. So both the social capital between the U.S. and Africa is really taking a back seat, given the kind of problem President Obama has gone through. So we have to be really very careful and say if it's improved tremendously. In fact, it's been a bit disappointing. However, there's a potential to reignite it, to give it a big boost in the next for the legacy. And I think there's no better place for President Obama today to really write off or write in the future its legacy, but Africa. And in fact, one of the key areas that to use a compassionate move, to use the Ebola crisis to really come in and do something that's really valuable for the continent. And there's tremendous amount of hopeful expectation from him. The key issue there is not to do it on the security and military conditions imperative only, but also on the economic opportunities for both the United States and Africa.
Now, apart from Ebola, what else would you like to see him intervene in almost immediately on the continent?
I'd like to see him make real promises come to action around Power Africa. I think that was a potentially very important initiative taken by the United States to help with the much-needed electricity deficit, energy deficit that the African continent does face. But so far we've seen it sort of shape up really as a program to benefit American companies. And so I think that there's a lot of potential in Power Africa that I would want to see move forward. I think expanding AGOA, making AGOA about more than just the limited trade in a few products, looking at it as a way to encourage greater levels of investment in Africa by American companies, that could make a real difference in the short term as well. So they would be two on my wish list.
Now, talking about AGOA, why is it so important to African development?
Well, going because it's an opportunity, that's what it says. An opportunity, a win-win opportunity for both of them. There hasn't been any other program or any other project that's really favorable to both places, both the African continent and the United States that way. So you have to put an emphasis on it. And why is it so important? It's not about selling arms or killing people. It's really basically on economic growth. And this is what Africa needs. Africa doesn't need weapons and military reinforcement anywhere, although we know there's some terrorist activities ongoing in Africa. And the point that makes it really clear for AGOA is it needs to be ramped up. It doesn't need to really go down. And that's when the reason is very important, because it will help Africa, African countries, African business people. But it's still very small. It's not as powerful as it should be, because we got to look next door. The Chinese are already there. They're planting flags all across the continent, and the U.S. flag is almost nowhere else to be seen.
You talk about the Chinese. Do you think the U.S. is threatened by this influence it has on the continent? That is China.
I think there is perhaps a little bit of wariness about Chinese forays into the continent, but I don't think the US is really threatened. I think that has been slightly overstated, quite frankly. I think that what we have seen is that the partnership opportunities for Africa have expanded with the greater involvement of emerging powers such as China, but also Brazil, India, to a lesser extent Russia. And that sort of opportunity of choice may not be so comfortable for our more traditional partners who are used to being, you know, the chosen ones, yes, the preferred partners. So it's probably a slightly more uncomfortable place. I don't think what President Obama is doing is in response to China. I don't think I would go as far as to say that he is feeling threatened.
Yeah, but when we look at the interest, it's unprecedented. When we look at China's interest in Africa, the U.S. is now suddenly interested in Africa. We as Africans, how do we take advantage of this?
Well, first of all, to piggyback on what Catherine has said, first, you know, the U.S. has to work with China, and Africans want that kind of partnership. We don't want any divided type of partnership with other people who are fighting on our soil. I mean, there's great concern that the U.S. and China might fight in the long term on this soil because they want a piece of it. But what is important in the question you're putting up is that Africa matters. And Africa matters. The Chinese have seen this. And if it matters for everybody else around the world, the U.S., the Europeans, China, Russia, Brazil, India, you know, Turkey even. Why is it not mattering so much for ourselves? And what are we doing? Everybody's got a plan for Africa. You got the U.S. plan for Africa, Chinese plan for Africa, exactly. European plan. Where is the African plan? Of course, we would think about the Africa Vision 2063, but it's still not yet grounded. We're not owning it yet. There are debates around it, all these very intellectual parts of conversation. Until we ground it and we explain it, we communicate more and more about it, what it means for each Africans, we're still going to be struggling. We don't know where to go to figure out that plan, but the best way is in the continent. And until we get these things in the continent, we're going to be struggling to get a piece here from China, a piece there from the United States. So that power for Africa to take ownership of its own future resides on the continent, not in Washington, not in Beijing, not in anywhere else on the European continent.
So when will Africans just get ownership of their own continent and their issues?
That's a very good question. I personally think that it's a big challenge, actually, to get African ownership, because the reality is that when you start to move away from very broad objectives that we can all agree on, you get into the specific details of things like economic policy, industrialisation, trade and regional integration even, these agenda items that are there for Africa. And they throw up issues around sovereignty, issues around the nation state. And I think that perhaps we're only going to see a real shared common vision once we have confident nation states on the African continent who are prepared to perhaps do away with a little bit of their individual power, a little bit of their individual sovereignty in favour of a broader common vision and common goal. I don't know when we're going to get there.
Well, that brings us to the end of yet another edition of Africa 360. Thanks to Koffi Kouakou and Catherine Grant-Makokera for sharing those key insights on the programme. Please share your views on our discussion today. You can do that by going to our Facebook page or tweet us your views at Africa360_ENCA. You can also send us an email to africa360@enca.com. So until next time, it's goodbye for now. Thanks for watching.